Start with a cliff. There is a limestone mountain in western Iran, standing over a spring and a plain where the caravan road runs, and about 300 feet up the rock face there is a carving. It is a long way up. There is no path to it, and no ledge under it. A man standing at the bottom on the road can see that something is there, and can see figures, and cannot read a word of it. That was the point. 2,500 years ago, a king had that panel cut, and had a very long statement carved beside it in 3 languages. And then, when the work was finished, he had the ledges the stonemasons had used chiseled away, so that nobody could ever climb up and change what it said. It stayed up there for 23 centuries. Travelers went past underneath it and made guesses. Some said it was a picture of Christ and the apostles. Some said it was a queen and her lovers. The road stayed busy the whole time and nobody could read it, because the writing on it was in a script that the world had forgotten how to read, and the languages had been dead for so long that there was no one left who even knew what they had been called. And what is written up there is the confession of an empire, or a lie about one. That is the argument, and we are going to spend a good deal of tonight inside it. This is the story of the Persian Empire, the first of them, the one historians call the Achaemenid, which lasted for about 220 years and stretched at its widest from the Aegean coast to the Indus Valley, and ruled somewhere near half the human beings alive on the earth at the time. It is one of the largest things people have ever built, and it is one of the least well known, and there is a specific reason for that, and I am going to be honest with you about the reason as we go. Almost everything you have heard about these people was written down by their enemies. Not all of it. That is the interesting part. There are tens of thousands of their own documents in the ground and in museum drawers, and they are not epics or victory poems. They are receipts, ration lists, travel permits, notes about how much beer went to a work gang at a particular place in a particular month. And when you set the receipts beside the famous stories, the two do not always agree, and the receipts are usually the ones telling the truth. So tonight, 3 things at once. The story as the Greeks told it, because it is a very good story, and because it is the version everybody knows. The story as the Persians told it about themselves, in stone, on cliffs and tomb faces, which is grander and more careful and not necessarily more honest. And underneath both of them, the clay tablets, which nobody wrote for posterity, and which are therefore the only part of this that has no agenda at all. We will end where we started, on the cliff, and we will end with the man who climbed it. There is no hurry in any of this. Let it come slowly. Before there was Persia, there was a plateau, and the plateau is the reason for everything that follows. Iran is high ground, not mountains everywhere, but a raised interior sitting well above sea level, ringed almost the whole way round by mountain chains, and in the middle of it 2 deserts so salt and dry that they are effectively holes in the map. People live around the edges of that, in the valleys where the mountains catch snow, and the snow melts in the spring, and the water runs down. 2 facts follow from the geography, and they run through the next 1,000 years. The first is that the water arrives all at once, and then stops. So people learn to go and find it underground. They dug shafts down to the water table at the foot of the mountains, and then cut a tunnel, almost level, sloping very slightly downhill, running for miles under the desert to bring the water out to a village without letting the sun get at it. They dug the shafts every few dozen yards along the line, so the diggers could breathe and get the spoil out. From the air, the finished thing looks like a dotted line of little craters running across brown ground. They are called kunarts, and some of them have been running continuously for 2,500 years, and some of them are still running now. The second fact is that a plateau ringed with mountains is defensible and hard to cross. but the passes through it connect the Mediterranean world to Central Asia and to India. Whoever holds this ground sits on the hinge between East and West. Everybody who wants to trade has to come through, and eventually somebody works out that this is a thing you can charge for, and then organize, and then rule. The people we are talking about came down onto that plateau, probably from the north and the northeast, sometime in the second millennium before Christ. They spoke a language related to Sanskrit, and further back to Greek and Latin, and eventually to English. They called themselves Aryans, which meant something like the noble ones, and which is where the modern name Iran comes from. It is worth saying clearly, because the word has been badly poisoned by the 20th century, that in its original use, it was simply what these people called themselves, and it has nothing to do with what a set of European racial theorists did with it 3,000 years later. Two of these groups matter. The Medes settled in the northwest, around a city called Ecbatana, up in the hills where it snows, and further south, in a rocky, poorer, less impressive region, a group settled who called their country Parsa. The Greeks turned that into Persis, and we turned it into Persia. For a long time, neither of them mattered at all, because to the west there was Assyria. If you want to understand what the Persian Empire was, it helps enormously to know what came immediately before it, because they are the same shape and a completely different temperature. The Assyrians ruled northern Mesopotamia, and at their peak, most of the Near East. They were extremely good at war, and they were the first people to run a genuinely professional imperial army. And their public relations strategy was terror, deliberately as policy. They carved their own atrocities on their palace walls, in detail at length, and they wrote them out in the annals. Cities burned, populations deported wholesale, rebel leaders flayed, and their skins nailed up on the walls of their own towns, heaps of severed heads counted and recorded. They did this not because they were unusually cruel by the standards of the age, but because they had worked out that a reputation does the work of a garrison. If everyone knows what happens when you rebel, fewer people rebel. It worked for 250 years, and then it stopped working, quite suddenly, the way these things do. In the last quarter of the 7th century before Christ, Assyria came apart under civil war and pressure from every direction. And in 612, an alliance of Babylonians and Medes took Nineveh, which was the largest city in the world, and destroyed it so thoroughly that when a Greek army marched past the site 200 years later, they had no idea what it was. They walked past the ruins of the greatest city on earth and did not know it had a name. The empire that had frightened everybody for 2.5 centuries left a gap, and 3 powers moved into it. Babylon took the south and west. Egypt took what it could reach, and the Medes took the north and the Plateau. Now, here I want to slow down, because this is the first place where the honest version and the famous version separate. The famous version, and it comes from Herodotus, is that the Medes built a real empire, a line of kings, a capital at Ecbatana with 7 concentric walls painted in 7 colors, a court, an administration, the whole apparatus, and the Persians as their vassals down south, until the Persians overthrew them. The trouble is that outside of Herodotus, there is remarkably little to support it. No Median royal inscriptions, no Median administrative documents, no securely identified Median palace. The archaeology of the region in that period shows fortified settlements, not an imperial capital. A serious body of scholarship over the last 40 years has argued that the Median Empire may be substantially a Greek literary construction, that Herodotus, writing a century later and needing a sequence of empires to structure his history, gave the Medes an empire because the pattern required one. I am not going to tell you the Medes did not matter. They did. They helped destroy Nineveh. They were powerful, and every later Persian king took care to keep Media close and to marry into it. What I am telling you is that the tidy story of a great Median empire that Cyrus inherited is much less certain than it sounds when you read it in a summary, and you should hold it loosely. That is going to keep happening tonight. It is worth getting used to now. Let us walk for a while. There is going to be a road through this story, and it is the most Persian thing in it, so I want you to have the feel of it before we get to the man who built it. You are on the road, somewhere in the middle of it, and it is early before the heat. The surface under you is not paved. It is graded and cleared and kept, which is different, and out here better. Gravel and packed earth, a track wide enough for 2 carts to pass, running dead ahead across brown, open country towards low hills you have been looking at since yesterday, and which do not appear to be getting closer. There are milestones. Somebody has counted this whole distance and marked it, and you have got into the habit of reading them without meaning to. Ahead of you, an hour off, there is a station. You cannot see it yet, but you know it is there, because you were told last night exactly how far it was, and because the whole road is built out of these. A walled compound every day's ride, with a well and a stable and a room to sleep in, and someone whose job it is to be there. Fresh horses in the stable that are not yours and that you cannot have. Those belong to the couriers. The couriers are the only thing on this road that moves faster than walking pace. A rider comes up behind you with a leather satchel and goes past, and the dust hangs in the air for a while afterwards, and he does not stop at the station for more than the time it takes to change horses and hand the bag over. Then someone else rides on with it, day and night, in relay in any weather. A letter travels this road in a week. You will take 3 months. And nothing happens for hours. That is what the road actually is. Not adventure. Sun on the back of your neck, the sound of your own feet, and a long, level, well-kept, entirely safe emptiness, going on, from one walled yard with a well in it to the next. The man who took the plateau and turned it into the largest empire on earth is called Cyrus, and that is not what his mother called him. In his own language, he was Cyrus. The name we use is what the Greeks made of it, and then what Latin made of that. I am going to use the Greek forms tonight, and I want to be upfront about why, because it is a small dishonesty that I am choosing on purpose. Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, Cambyses, these are Greek names for Persian men. Their own names were Cyrus, Darius, Sheasha, Cambyses. If I used those, you would have a harder time following, and you would not be able to look anything up afterwards, and half of you would be asleep before the second syllable, which is admittedly the goal, but not like that. So, Greek forms, said once here, and remembered. Cyrus came to the throne of a small kingdom around 559 before Christ. His title was King of Anshan, which was an old Elumite city and region in the southwest of the Plateau, and that title tells you something. He was not calling himself King of the Persians. He was using a local name with a long history behind it, and he did that his whole life, and it is the first sign of the thing that made him unusual. His origins are covered in the sort of story that gathers round successful men. Herodotus gives him a full folk tale childhood. His grandfather is Xerxes, king of the Medes, who dreams that his daughter's child will overthrow him and orders the baby killed. The official given the job cannot do it and hands the child to a herdsman, whose wife has just had a stillborn baby, and the 2 infants are swapped, and Cyrus grows up in a hut in the hills, and at 10 years old he is playing at being king with the other boys, and behaves so royally that he is found out. That is a very old story. It is also the story of Sargon of Akkad, and of Moses, and of Romulus, and later of Oedipus, and much later of a great many others. The abandoned royal infant raised by the poor is one of the oldest narrative shapes there is, and its presence in a biography is a reliable sign that we have crossed out of history and into legend. So enjoy it, do not bank on it. What is solid is what happened after 553. Cyrus revolted against Xerxes. Babylonian chronicle tablets, which are dry year-by-year records kept by scribes, and which are much better evidence than any Greek narrative, confirm the outline. There was a campaign, it lasted 3 years, and Xerxes' own army mutinied and handed him over. Cyrus took Ecbatana and its treasury, and did not kill him. That is the first data point about the man. The Assyrian answer to a defeated king was well established, and involved a hook and a wall. Cyrus took the treasury, kept the administration, kept Median nobles in senior positions for the rest of his life, and let the old king live. It is possible this was pure calculation, given what he did next, and next after that. I think it is more accurate to say that he had noticed something about how large territories are actually held, and that terror is expensive and gratitude is cheap. He then spent about 15 years taking everything within reach. Lydia first, in the west, in what is now Turkey. Its king was Croesus, who had so much gold that his name became a proverb for it in a language that would not exist for another 1,000 years. Herodotus gives Croesus the most famous consultation in the ancient world. He sends to the oracle at Delphi to ask whether he should attack Persia, and is told that if he crosses the river Halys, he will destroy a great empire. So he crosses, and he does destroy a great empire, and it is his own. That story is almost certainly a construction after the fact. Oracles become unambiguous in hindsight, but the campaign is real. Cyrus beat him in the field, and then did something that nobody expected. Campaigning season was over. Croesus went home to Sardis and dismissed his troops for the winter, and Cyrus did not go home. He followed him through the winter, arrived at Sardis before the army could be recalled, and took the citadel by sending men up a section of cliff so steep that it was left unguarded. What happened to Croesus after that, nobody knows. Herodotus has him placed on a pyre and saved from it at the last moment. A Greek poem written earlier has Apollo carry him off. A Babylonian chronicle fragment has been read as saying he was killed, though the text is broken exactly where it matters. Take your pick. The honest answer is that we do not know how one of the most famous men in the ancient world died. And then, in 539, Cyrus took Babylon, and Babylon is where you can actually watch him work. Babylon was the greatest city on earth. It had walls that the Greeks could not describe without exaggerating, and it had a temple to the god Marduk at its center, and it had a priesthood who considered themselves the guardians of civilization, and it had a king called Nabonidus who had made himself extremely unpopular with them. Nabonidus had spent about 10 years of his reign not in Babylon at all, but in an oasis in northern Arabia, for reasons that are still argued about. And while he was away, the Great New Year festival could not be performed, because the festival required the king to take the hand of Marduk in person, and there was no king there to take it. 10 years of the most important religious event in the calendar simply not happening. And on top of that, he had spent enormous effort promoting the moon god, Sin, above Marduk, in Marduk's own city. So when Cyrus came down the Tigris in the autumn of 539, there was a substantial faction inside Babylon that did not mind very much. The Persian army beat the Babylonians at Opis. Sippar surrendered without a fight, and then Babylon opened its gates. There was no siege and no sack. Cyrus entered the city later that month, and the chronicle records that green branches were spread in front of him. Now watch what he does, because this is the founding move of the entire empire, and every one of his successors copies it. He does not present himself as a foreign conqueror. He presents himself as the legitimate king of Babylon, chosen by Marduk, come to put right the neglect of a bad ruler. He has a text written in Ukkadian in the traditional style, and buried in the foundations of the city wall, as Babylonian kings had done for centuries. He takes the hand of Marduk. He restores the festival. He puts the statues of gods that Nabonidus had dragged into Babylon from other cities back where they came from, and he sends the people who had been resettled back to their own places along with them. That last part is why one particular group of exiles in Babylon thought extremely well of him and wrote it down, and their book is still being read. The Hebrew Bible calls Cyrus a shepherd, and in a passage that made later commentators deeply uncomfortable, calls him anointed Messiah, which is a word it does not apply to any other foreign ruler anywhere. He is the one who lets the exiles go home to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And the object all of this was written on is called the Cyrus cylinder, and it is in the British Museum, and I need to say something plain about it. You will have heard, possibly many times, that the Cyrus cylinder is the first declaration of human rights. There are replicas of it at the United Nations. It has been described that way by heads of state. It is not. I am not saying that to be clever, and I am not saying it because Cyrus was secretly terrible. I am saying it because the claim is simply not in the text, and anyone can go and read a translation in 10 minutes and see that it is not. The cylinder is a building inscription. It is a standard, recognizable, well-attested genre of Mesopotamian royal document, the kind of thing kings had been burying in walls for 1,000 years before Cyrus was born, and it follows the conventions of that genre closely enough that scholars can point to the older texts it echoes. It says that Marduk was angry with Nabonidus, that Marduk searched for a righteous ruler and chose Cyrus, that Cyrus entered the city peacefully, that he restored the temples and returned the gods and let displaced peoples go home. It is propaganda written in the voice of the local priesthood, and it is very good propaganda, and it is about Babylon. It says nothing about universal rights. It does not abolish slavery. It does not declare freedom of religion as a principle. It does not mention anybody outside the territory it concerns. The human rights reading was popularized in 1971 during the Shah of Iran's celebration of 2,500 years of Persian monarchy, when a replica was presented to the United Nations, and it has been repeated ever since because it is a lovely idea. Here is what I would say instead, and I think it is more impressive rather than less. Cyrus did not invent human rights. What he did invent, or at least what he was the first to run at this scale, was a completely different theory of how to hold an empire together. Assyria said, "Obey, or we will do to you what we did to them." Cyrus said, "Keep your gods, keep your customs, keep your local elites in their jobs, keep your law and pay your tax, and I will be the legitimate king in your own tradition, described in your own language by your own priests." That is not kindness. It is a policy, and it is a policy because it works. Rebellion is expensive. Garrisons are expensive. A population that has not been humiliated and whose temple is still standing is very much cheaper to govern than one that has. Every one of his successors used it, and the empire held together for 2 centuries on it. And when it finally fell, it fell to an invasion and not to its own subjects. He died in 530. The circumstances are, once again, disputed. Herodotus has him killed in Central Asia, fighting a nomadic people called the Massajuti, whose queen Tomiris, having lost her son to him, has his corpse's head pushed into a skin filled with blood, so that he can at last drink his fill of it. Xenophon, writing a different kind of book with a different agenda, has him die peacefully in bed, surrounded by his sons, giving a long speech about virtue. Both authors are Greek, neither was there, and the 2 accounts cannot both be true. What is not disputed is the tomb, because it is still standing. It is at Pusargadi, which was his own foundation up on the plain, and it is very small, 6 stone steps receding, and on top of them a plain gabled chamber about the size of a modest room, with a low door. There is no relief carving. There are no boasts. There is no inscription on it at all now, though ancient writers report one, and what they report it as saying is roughly this: I am Cyrus, who made this empire. Do not begrudge me this small piece of earth that covers my body. 200 years later, a young Macedonian king who had just conquered the entire Persian Empire went out of his way to visit that tomb, found it had been broken into and stripped, and was angry enough about it to order the tomb restored and to have the people responsible questioned under torture. The empire's founder is buried in a stone box the size of a shed, on an empty plain, and it is still there, and you can walk up to it. Back on the road. It is late afternoon now, and you have come down into a river valley, and the road goes to a crossing where somebody official is sitting under an awning. This is the other half of what the road is. It is not only a road. It is a checkpoint, repeated. There are guard posts at the crossings and at the ends of the difficult passes, and there is a man at each of them with a list. You have a document. It is a small clay tablet, or a bit of leather with a seal on it, and it says who authorized your journey and how many people you are, and it entitles you to a specific ration at each station along the way. So much flour a day, so much wine or beer, and if you are senior enough, so much meat. The amount is written down. It is not a courtesy, and it is not charity. It is an allocation, and it comes out of a store's account, and somewhere a scribe is going to write down that you drew it. That is why we know so much about this. Not because anybody wanted to tell us, because a man at a river crossing in the 5th century, before Christ, had to account for his flour. The official reads your tablet. He is not friendly, and he is not hostile. He is bored, because he does this 11 times a day. He hands it back, and you go down to the ferry, and behind you he takes a fresh piece of damp clay and presses out a note of what he has just given away, and puts it in a basket with the others. And in about 2,500 years, somebody is going to dig that basket up. Cyrus left 2 sons, and the elder one got the empire, and history has been unkind to him in a way that the evidence does not really support. His name was Cambyses, and he ruled for 8 years, and in that time he did the one thing his father had not managed, which was to take Egypt. Egypt in the 6th century, before Christ, was not a spent force. It was the oldest continuous civilization on earth by an enormous margin. When Cambyses marched on it, the pyramids at Giza were already about 2,000 years old, which is a longer gap than the one between Cambyses and us. It was rich, it was defended by desert on both sides, and it had a fleet. He took it in a single campaign in 525. He got across the Sinai by making an arrangement with the Arab tribes who controlled the water on that route, which is the practical detail that actually decides the campaign and which nobody remembers. He beat the Egyptian army at Pelusium in the Delta. The pharaoh, Psamtik III, had been on the throne for about 6 months. He fell back on Memphis, and Memphis fell, and Egypt became a Persian province and stayed on and off for the next 200 years. And then, according to the Greeks, Cambyses went mad. The account is in Herodotus, and it is spectacular. He mocks the Egyptian gods. He opens ancient tombs to look at the bodies. He has the mummy of a previous pharaoh dragged out, whipped and burned. He kills his own brother. He marries his sister and then kills her, kicking her while she is pregnant. He shoots a courtier's son through the heart with an arrow to prove that his hand is steady and he is not drunk. He buries 12 noble Persians alive, head down. He sends an army of 50,000 men across the desert to the oracle at Siwa, and they are swallowed by a sandstorm and never seen again. And the centerpiece of all of it, he goes to Memphis, finds the Egyptians celebrating the appearance of a new Ibis bull, a living animal in which a god was held to be present, the single most sacred thing in the country, and in a fit of contempt draws his dagger and stabs it in the thigh and laughs at the priests, and the bull dies, and the god is murdered by a foreigner in his own temple. It is a very good story, and in the 1850s, excavations at the Serupium at Sukhara, which is the underground gallery where the Ibis bulls were buried in enormous stone sarcophagi, turned up the burial of the Ibis that died during the reign of Cambyses. It was buried with full honors. There is an inscription. Cambyses is named on it in proper pharaonic style, and he is shown paying his respects to the dead bull, and the burial is entirely regular in every way. There is more. There is a statue in the Vatican of an Egyptian official called Ujahoresnit, who had been a naval commander under the last pharaohs and who went over to the Persians and had a long career. He wrote his autobiography on the statue, which is what Egyptian officials did, and it describes what happened. He says he was the one who taught the new king the proper Egyptian titles and forms. He says Cambyses took a full pharaonic titulary. He says foreign troops had been quartered in the temple precinct at Sais, and that he petitioned the king to have them removed, and the king ordered them removed, and the temple purified, and its revenues restored, and its festivals resumed. That is an Egyptian priest, writing for an Egyptian audience under Persian rule, describing a conqueror who behaved exactly as his father would have. So what happened? Two things, probably. The first is that Cambyses did cut costs. There is a papyrus which records that he sharply reduced the state subsidies to most Egyptian temples, not abolished, reduced, and unevenly, with a few favored temples keeping everything. If you are a priesthood whose income has just been halved by a foreign king, you will remember that king a particular way, and you will tell your grandchildren about him. And in a century or so, a curious Greek will arrive asking questions, and you will tell him too. The second is Darius, and we are about to get to Darius, and there is a reason he might have found it convenient for the previous king to be remembered as a lunatic. Cambyses died in 522 in Syria, on his way home in a hurry because something had gone very wrong behind him. The manner of it is odd and oddly convincing. He was mounting his horse, and the tip of his own sword came out of its sheath and went into his thigh, and the wound went bad, and he died of it some weeks later. Herodotus notes, with satisfaction, that it was the same part of the body where he had supposedly stabbed the bull. Persia's own official account, which we are about to read, says something different and much shorter. It says he died his own death. That phrase is doing an enormous amount of work, and it was carved on the orders of the man who took the throne. So, the cliff. The mountain is called Behistun, and it stands over the main road from Babylon up to Ecbatana, at a place where there is a good spring and where caravans have stopped for as long as there have been caravans. The panel is about 15 feet high and 25 across, 300 feet up. The relief shows a king, life-size, standing with his bow lowered, and one foot planted on the chest of a man lying on his back with his arms raised. Behind that figure, 9 men are roped together at the neck in a line, each of them in a different costume so that you can tell what nation each one comes from, their hands tied behind them. Above the whole scene floats a figure in a winged disc. Behind the king stand 2 attendants, a bow carrier and a spear carrier. And beside and below it, filling every available surface, is the longest royal inscription anyone had ever cut, in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elumite, and Babylonian, about 1,200 lines all told. It is the autobiography of Darius I, and it covers a single year, and it is the single most important document in Persian history, and I want to walk you through what it says before we take it apart. It begins with lineage. I am Darius, great king, king of kings, king in Persia, son of Hystaspes, grandson of Arsumes and Achaemenid. It gives 8 generations. It says, by the favor of Ahura I am king. Then it tells the story. Cambyses, it says, had a brother called Bardia, of the same mother and the same father, and Cambyses killed that brother in secret before he ever went to Egypt, and the people did not know that Bardia was dead. Then, while Cambyses was away in Egypt, a man rose up. He was a magus, a priest, and his name was Gaumata, and he lied to the people. He said, I am Bardia, son of Cyrus, brother of Cambyses, and the whole empire went over to him, Persia, Media, all the provinces, and he took the kingship. Then Cambyses died his own death, and nobody dared say anything against Gaumata. The inscription says, until I came. Nobody, not one man, neither Persian nor Mede nor any one of our family, could take the kingdom from him. The people feared him greatly, because he had killed many who had known the real Bardia. And then I prayed to Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda bore me aid, and with a few men I killed that Gaumata the Magus, and the men who were his foremost followers, in a fortress in Media. I took the kingdom from him. By the favor of Ahura Mazda, I became king. And after that, the inscription says, the whole world revolted. That part is the bulk of the text, and there is no reason to doubt its outline, because the scale of it is not flattering, and no one invents a year that bad. Babylon rose. Elam rose. Media rose twice. Persia itself rose twice. Egypt, Parthia, Margiana, Satu Judea, Scythia, Armenia, Sugasha. Almost every province of the empire declared independence in the space of a few months, most of them under men claiming to be the descendants of their own old royal houses. And Darius put all of it down in a single year. 19 battles, 9 kings captured. The inscription lists each rebellion in turn, names the pretender, names the battle, gives the date to the day, and states the outcome, and the outcomes are extremely blunt. This is where the tone shifts, and where you can hear an actual voice. I cut off his nose and his ears and his tongue, and I put out one eye, and he was held bound at my palace gate, and all the people saw him, and afterwards I impaled him. The 9 roped men above the text are those 9 kings. The man under the king's foot is Gaumata. And then, near the end, the inscription starts to protest. This is the part that keeps historians awake. Darius says more than once, in slightly different words, what I have done, I did in one and the same year. He says, this is true, not false. He says, Ahura Mazda bore me aid because I was not disloyal, I was not a liar, I did no wrong. Neither I nor my family, I ruled according to righteousness. He says, you who shall read this inscription hereafter, do not think it is lies. He says, believe what I have done. Do not conceal it from the people. If you do not conceal it, may Ahura Mazda be your friend, and if you conceal it, may Ahura Mazda smite you. And he built the thing 300 feet up a cliff, and then had the ledges cut away. Here is the problem, and it is a beautiful one. Everything about this document is designed to be permanent and unalterable and unreachable, and everything about its argument is defensive. The man is standing on a rock face, shouting that he is not a liar, at people who cannot climb up to check. The alternative reading goes like this, and a serious minority of scholars have held it for a long time. There was no impostor. Bardia was Bardia. He was the real son of Cyrus, and he took the throne when his brother died, entirely legitimately, and he was popular enough that the whole empire accepted him without a fight, which the inscription itself concedes, and which is very hard to explain if he was a random priest wearing another man's name. Herodotus adds a detail that makes it worse rather than better. He says the impostor happened to resemble the real prince, and even had the same name. And then Darius, who was not in the line of succession, He was a spear carrier, a member of a collateral branch, the son of a satrap, killed him with 6 friends, and needed a reason. So he supplied one, and the reason had to explain why the man everyone had been obeying for 7 months was not who he said he was, and why killing him was not regicide, but the removal of a fraud. Hence the secret murder of the real Bardia years earlier, which conveniently no one witnessed. Hence Cambyses dying his own death, which forecloses the question of whether Darius had anything to do with that too. Hence, possibly, the whole tradition of Cambyses as a madman, which makes a secret fratricide plausible. And hence, on this reading, the year of revolts, because if a usurper had just murdered the legitimate king, you would expect exactly that. The entire empire rising at once under local claimants in the belief that the dynasty had ended. I want to be careful here, because I am not telling you this is what happened. It is not proven, and it cannot be. There is a genuine case for Darius' version. The empire was new, 20 years old, and a rebellion by an ambitious priest during an absent king's foreign war is not implausible. And the Behistun account was published in multiple languages and circulated across the empire. A copy on papyrus turned up at a Jewish military colony on an island in the Nile in Egypt a century later, and fragments of a stone version were found at Babylon. So it was making a claim that people in a position to know could hear. What I am telling you is that this is the founding document of the greatest dynasty of the ancient world, that its author had an obvious motive to lie, that the document's own rhetoric is unusually anxious, and that we have no independent source for the one fact everything turns on. He also did one more thing that is worth sitting with. Darius says in the inscription that he had it written in a new way, in Aryan, which had not been done before. He appears to be claiming that he invented the old Persian script, and that is broadly consistent with the evidence. Old Persian cuneiform is a small, tidy, semi-alphabetic system of about 36 signs, quite unlike the sprawling syllabaries around it, and it looks designed rather than evolved, and there is no securely dated example of it earlier than Darius. So the man who may have needed to invent a justification for his kingship also, quite possibly, invented the writing system in which he carved it. Whether or not he stole the throne, he then ran it for 36 years, and he was extraordinarily good at it. And this is where the empire stops being a conquest and becomes a machine. Let us go back to the road, because he is the one who built it properly. You are at a station in the evening. There is a wall and a gate, and inside it a yard with a well and a trough, stabling along one side, and a long, low room where travelers sleep on the floor. There is a smell of dung and dust and wood smoke. There is a man doing accounts by a lamp. The stations are a day apart, not roughly a day measured, because the whole road was surveyed, and the stations placed at intervals that a normal party could actually manage. A Greek who came through this way reported the count and the distances, and modern archaeologists tracing the route on the ground have found the numbers broadly hold up. From Sardis, near the Aegean coast, to Susa, down in the southwest of the Plateau, is somewhere over 1,600 miles by this road. On foot, about 90 days. 3 months of this, 90 mornings, and 90 of these yards. And the royal couriers did it in a week. They did it by relay, with fresh men and fresh horses waiting at every station, riding through the night, handing the satchel on. And the Greek who described it wrote a sentence about them that has had an unlikely afterlife. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness stops these men from completing their appointed course as fast as they possibly can. 2,500 years later, a version of that line was carved on the front of the main post office in New York, where it is generally assumed to be about the American Postal Service, and it is actually about Persian horsemen. Put your head down on the floor of that long room with the others. There is a lamp still going at the far end. Somebody's animal is shifting outside. Tomorrow is another one of these. 90 of them. Now the tablets. In 1933, an American excavation team working at Persepolis dug into the fortification wall at the northeast corner of the terrace and found a room, and the room was full of clay. About 30,000 tablets and fragments, small ones, most of them fitting in a palm, covered in cuneiform, mostly in Elumite with some Aramaic. They had been thrown into that space as archive dead storage, and they had been baked hard and preserved by the fire that destroyed the building 180 years later, which is the recurring irony of ancient archives. They survive because somebody burned them. They date from around 509 to 494 before Christ, which is the middle of Darius' reign, and they are almost entirely receipts. There is not a single line of poetry in them. There are no royal boasts. Nobody is trying to impress anybody. They are the internal paperwork of an administrative district, food moving in and out of stores, workers being paid in barley and wine and sheep, travelers drawing rations, livestock being counted. And they are the best evidence we have for what this empire was actually like to live in, precisely because nobody wrote them for us. Here is what is in them. Workers were paid in kind on a scale, grain, wine or beer, and sometimes meat in monthly allocations, with the amount depending on skill and seniority. The work gangs are called by a term that just means workers, and they are found all over the region, and they include very large numbers of people who had been moved from somewhere else: Egyptians, Ionians, Thracians, Babylonians, Bactrians, working in Persia far from where they were born. Some of these were deportees. Some appear to have been recruited or contracted. The tablets do not usually tell us which, and it would be dishonest of me to make them sound like either a workforce of free laborers or a slave state, because the reality was a spectrum, and the receipts do not record the difference. Women appear constantly, and this is the part that always surprises people. Women worked in the same gangs as men and drew rations under their own names. Some of them supervised. There is a job title for a female work gang chief, and the women holding it drew rations at a higher rate than the men they supervised. Skill determined pay more consistently than sex did. New mothers received a bonus ration. It is recorded plainly as an entitlement with an amount: extra grain and extra wine for a woman who had given birth. And here is the detail that stops you romanticizing it. The bonus was doubled if the baby was a boy. That is the value of this kind of evidence in one line. It gives you a state that has a formal maternity benefit 2,500 years ago, and it tells you in the same breath exactly what that state thought a daughter was worth. The tablets name people, not kings, administrators. The most frequent name in the whole archive belongs to a man called Parnarca, who was Darius' uncle and who ran the whole regional economy. And we know what he ate, because his daily allowance is recorded: 2 sheep and something on the order of 90 quarts of wine, and a great deal of flour. That is not a man's dinner. That is a household and a staff, and a table that people were expected to eat at. And there are women with estates of their own, issuing sealed orders in their own names, drawing on their own stores. One of them is Ertashduna, who is the woman Greek writers call Artistone, a daughter of Cyrus and a wife of Darius. Her seal is on tablets authorizing the release of wine from her own holdings. She is not a decorative queen in a story. She is a landowner signing off on inventory. That is the machine. Now the shape of it. Darius divided the empire into provinces. The Greek word is satrapies, each under a governor called a satrap, who was usually a Persian and frequently a relative. The satrap ran civil administration and justice and collected the tribute. But the garrison commander in his province often reported separately, and so did the treasury official, and royal inspectors travelled the roads and turned up unannounced. It is a deliberate separation of powers, not out of any love of liberty, but because a satrap who controlled the money and the troops and the courts in the same province would be a king in 3 years, and Darius had just spent a year putting down men exactly like that. He fixed the tribute. Each province owed a set annual amount, assessed in silver by weight, and the assessment was written down, and it did not change at the whim of a passing official. That is less exciting than a battle, and it matters more. A predictable tax is one you can plan around. An unpredictable one is indistinguishable from robbery. He standardized weights and measures. He issued a gold coin so reliable that it circulated for centuries and was accepted well outside the empire's borders. He finished a canal from the Nile to the Red Sea and put up stelae along it in 4 languages saying so, and one of them survives. And what it says is that ships went from Egypt to Persia by that canal, as he had intended. He sent an expedition down the Indus and along the coast of the Arabian Sea to find out what was there and to establish that it could be sailed. He was interested in what the world's shape was, in a practical, commercial, this is mine sort of way. And underneath all of it, there is Aramaic, not Persian, the administrative language that held this empire together from the Aegean to the Indus, was a Semitic language written in an alphabet, which nobody had ordered anybody to adopt, and which spread simply because it was easy to write on parchment, and everyone in the western half of the empire already used it. Letters went out from the center in Aramaic, and were read aloud and translated into the local language at the other end by an official whose job that was. The empire ran in a language that was not the king's, in a script the king had not invented, and it worked better for it. There is one more thing in the tablets, and it is the thing they are least often asked about, which is what these people believed. The kings tell us, at the top of their voices, on every surface they could reach. Every royal inscription begins the same way, near enough. A great god is Ahura who created this earth, who created that sky, who created man, who created happiness for man, who made Darius king. Ahura is the wise lord. He is a creator god, associated with light and truth and order, and set against him is the lie, a word that comes up constantly in Persian royal texts, and which is not a small thing. At Behistun, when Darius explains why the provinces rebelled, his answer is, the lie made them rebellious. The rebel kings are called liars. The whole moral architecture of the empire, as the kings present it, is truth against falsehood, order against disorder, and the king is the man Ahura Mazda has appointed to hold the first against the second. That is recognizably Zoroastrian. Ahura Mazda is the god of Zoroastrianism, the religion founded by a prophet whose name in Greek is Zoroaster, and in his own language something like Zarathustra, and which is one of the oldest continuously practiced faiths on earth, and which is still practiced now, in Iran and India, and by a diaspora. And yet, no Achaemenid king anywhere in any inscription mentions Zarathustra. Not once. There is no reference to the founding prophet, none to the scriptures, none to the specific doctrines that make Zoroastrianism distinctive, the final judgment, the resurrection, the bridge the soul must cross. The kings invoke Ahura Mazda constantly and mention other gods occasionally and never name the prophet. There is also the burial problem. Zoroastrian practice, as it is known from later periods, holds that a corpse pollutes earth and fire, and so the dead are exposed rather than buried or cremated. The Achaemenid kings were placed in rock-cut tombs. Cyrus is in a stone chamber at Pusargadi. Darius is in a cliff. So the honest position is, they worshipped the god at the center of Zoroastrianism, used its central moral vocabulary, and either practiced an earlier form of the religion that had not yet developed the features we recognize, or practiced a related Iranian religion from which Zoroastrianism also grew, or were Zoroastrians whose burial customs differed from later orthodoxy. Specialists have argued all three for a century, and the argument is not settled. What can be said is that this was not a state church. Whatever the kings believed, they did not export it, and the empire's policy of leaving local worship alone was consistent and deliberate. There is one apparent exception, and it is worth handling carefully because it gets quoted a lot. Xerxes left an inscription, found at Persepolis, in which he says that in one of his lands there had been a place where demons were worshipped, and that he destroyed the sanctuary of the demons, and proclaimed that the demons shall not be worshipped, and worshipped Ahura Mazda there instead. That reads like religious persecution, and it has often been presented that way, and it has been attached to the Babylonian revolts and to the destruction of a temple there. But the text does not say where the place was. It does not name the land, or the demons, or the year. And the same formula appears in other Achaemenid inscriptions as a general statement of royal virtue rather than a report of a specific act. It may be a description of something that happened. It may be a piece of boilerplate about the king's role as the enemy of disorder. We do not know which, and confident accounts either way are going beyond the evidence. What the tablets add is the ordinary side of it. The fortification archive records rations issued for religious ceremonies, and the interesting thing about them is the variety. There are allocations for offerings to Ahura Mazda. There are also allocations for offerings to Elumite gods with Elumite names, made by Elumite priests, paid for out of the same royal stores in the Persian heartland under Darius. There are ceremonies for rivers and for mountains. The state was paying for the worship of the gods of the people it had conquered in its own homeland, out of the same account it used to pay for the king's own religion, and it filed the receipts together. Around 518 before Christ, Darius started building something in the south, in the Persian homeland, at the foot of a mountain, out on a plain, and it took 60 years and 3 kings to finish. The Persians called it Parsa. The Greeks called it Persepolis, which means the city of the Persians, and that is the name that stuck. It was not the capital. This is the first thing to get straight, because it is usually described as one. The empire was governed from Susa mostly, which was old and hot and low-lying and full of scribes, and from Babylon in the winter, and from Ecbatana up in the hills in the summer, because it was cooler. Those were where the work happened. Persepolis was somewhere else entirely. It sits on a terrace. That is the first fact about it, and it explains the rest. They cut and leveled an artificial platform against the flank of the mountain, roughly a third of a mile long, 40 feet up, faced with enormous fitted blocks laid without mortar, and put a double staircase up the front of it wide enough for 10 horsemen to ride up abreast and shallow enough that they could do it without dismounting. Everything on that platform is designed around the experience of arriving. You come up the stairs. You pass through a monumental gateway with 2 vast human-headed winged bulls flanking the entrance, staring outward in the Assyrian manner, because a Persian king borrowing an Assyrian image at his own front door is making a statement about who inherited what. There is an inscription on it. It says that the king built this gate, and it calls it the Gate of All Lands. And then you are in an open space, and ahead of you is the audience hall, which is called the Apudana, and which is enormous and structurally almost nothing. 72 stone columns, 65 feet tall, thin, fluted, with capitals carved as the paired foreparts of bulls or lions, holding up a flat cedar roof. Between them, nothing. No walls in the interior. It is a forest of columns and open air and shade, and the whole thing could hold something like 10,000 people standing. Persian columns are the thinnest and most widely spaced of any monumental architecture in the ancient world, and the reason is timber. They had good long cedar from Lebanon, brought in on the tribute, and a wooden beam will span a distance that a stone lintel will not. So the room can be open. A Greek temple is a stone box with a colonnade round the outside, and a small dark room within. This is the opposite. An interior you can walk into and get lost in, with light coming through in bars. And on the two great staircases of the Apudana, carved along the whole length of the retaining walls, is the thing that makes Persepolis worth the trip. It is a procession, 23 delegations, one after another, each led by a Persian or Median usher who is holding the leader of the delegation by the hand, and each bringing gifts. You can identify every one of them, because the sculptors were careful, and because the costume of each nation is exactly rendered. The Medes in their round, caps and trousers. The Elumites bringing a lioness and her cubs. The Armenians with a horse and a large two-handled vessel. The Babylonians with a humped bull and folded textiles. The Lydians with metal bowls and a chariot. The Bactrians with a camel. The Indians in loincloths, barefoot, carrying baskets of what is probably gold dust and leading a donkey. The Arabs with a dromedary. The Ethiopians with an okapi and an elephant tusk. The Scythians with their pointed hats and their folded trousers, leading a horse. The Ionian Greeks with bolts of cloth and bowls. And here is what is missing from all of it, and it took me a long time to notice. And once you notice it, you cannot stop noticing it. Nobody is bound. Nobody is kneeling. Nobody is being trampled or dragged or executed. There are no prisoners, no severed heads, no piles of the dead. There is not one violent image on the entire terrace. Compare that with the Assyrian palace reliefs, which show flaying and impalement and mass deportation in loving detail, and which were carved 200 years earlier by people whose empire covered a fraction of this one. The Persepolis reliefs show men in national dress walking calmly forward in an orderly queue, holding hands with their escorts, bringing what their country produces. Everyone is the same height. Everyone is intact. Now, this is not evidence that the Persian Empire was gentle. We have Behistun. We know exactly what Darius did to rebels, because he had it carved on a cliff with the parts of the body listed. The Persepolis reliefs are not a documentary. They are the official self-image of the state, and what that self-image consists of is a fiction of universal, willing, cheerful participation. But that in itself is the interesting fact. Every empire lies about itself, and the lie tells you what it wanted to be. Assyria wanted to be feared. Persia wanted to be joined. And it is worth something that when the Persians commissioned the greatest artistic statement they ever made, at ruinous expense, over 60 years, the thing they chose to show the world was the whole world walking up their stairs of its own accord, carrying things, and nobody in chains. What actually happened on that terrace is not known. The most popular theory is that Persepolis hosted an annual New Year ceremony, with delegations arriving from across the empire to present tribute, a theory that maps beautifully onto the reliefs, which is both its strength and the reason to be suspicious of it, because it may be a story invented to explain the pictures. Other scholars think it was primarily a ceremonial and religious complex, or a dynastic center, or a treasury and showpiece that was used only occasionally. The fortification tablets, which record the actual traffic, do not describe any grand annual festival. So, an enormous, expensive, exquisitely built place, and we do not know what it was for. Darius died in 486. He is buried a few miles away, in a cliff face at a site called Naksh-i-Rustam, in a tomb cut into the rock in the shape of a cross, with a carved facade of a palace front, and above it, the king standing on a platform held up by the representatives of all his nations. There are 4 such tombs in that cliff, and in front of them, cut into the same rock face many centuries later, are the reliefs of a completely different Persian dynasty who came along 700 years afterwards and wanted to be buried near the old kings, because even then the Achaemenids were the ancient past. There is one more Persian text I want to read with you before we leave, and it is on the tomb. Darius' tomb at Naksh-i-Rustam has 2 inscriptions on the facade. The first is the standard sort: Ahura Mazda, the creation of the world, the list of lands, the king's titles. The second one is not standard at all. It is a statement in the first person about what kind of man he considered himself to be, and there is nothing quite like it anywhere else in the ancient Near East. He says that Ahura Mazda made him the kind of man he is. He says that he is a friend to what is right and not to what is wrong, that it is not his wish that the weak should have wrong done to them by the strong, and it is equally not his wish that the strong should have wrong done to them by the weak. He says that what a man says against another man does not convince him until he has heard sworn evidence from both. He says that he is not hot-tempered, that when he feels anger rising in him, he holds it back firmly by his thinking power, and that he is in firm control of his own impulses. He says that a man who works, he rewards according to the work, and a man who does harm, he punishes according to the harm. He says that he is trained with both hands and both feet, that as a horseman he is a good horseman, as a bowman a good bowman both on foot and on horseback, as a spearman a good spearman. And then, having listed his own accomplishments, he adds a line that undercuts the whole thing rather beautifully. These skills that Ahura Mazda has bestowed on me, and I have had the strength to use them by the favor of Ahura Mazda, what I have done with these abilities that he gave me. And at the end, he says something to whoever is reading it. He says, "Do not think that whatever has been done by me was done by my own strength." And he says, "You who shall read this hereafter, let what has been done by me convince you, and do not think it lies." There it is again, the last line of a dead king's self-portrait, carved on his own tomb, is a request not to be thought a liar. You can decide for yourself whether that is the mark of an honest man who was accused of things he did not do, or of a man who took a throne he had no right to and spent 36 years, and the whole surface of every rock he could reach, insisting otherwise. The evidence does not settle it. That is not a failure of the evidence. That is what it is actually like to look at the deep past. You get the official version carved beautifully in stone, and you get the receipts, and between the two there is a gap where a man used to be. Once more onto the road, and then we will go to Greece, and the tone of the evidence is about to change completely. You are near the western end now. The country has changed. There are olive trees. The road comes down out of the hills towards the coast, and there is a different quality to the light, and the air smells of salt. At the station last night there were Greeks, not prisoners, traders, and a stonemason, and a man who was some kind of doctor and who had been at court. They spoke a bad, functional Aramaic like everyone does out here, and they talked, and it was a normal evening. That is worth holding on to for the next hour. The two halves of this story were not sealed off from each other. Greeks lived and worked all over this empire. Greek cities on the Turkish coast were Persian subjects for generations. Greek doctors served Persian kings. Greek mercenaries fought in Persian armies. Greek exiles turned up at Susa asking for asylum and got it, and were given towns to live off. A Greek called Herodotus, born in a Persian-ruled city on that coast, grew up a subject of this empire, and then wrote the book that taught Europe to think of it as the enemy. Everything from here on is a war between people who knew each other quite well. And now I have to tell you something about the sources, plainly, before we go any further, because it changes what the next section is worth. Up to this point, we have had Persian material to work with. Behistun, the fortification tablets, Egyptian inscriptions, Babylonian chronicles, building inscriptions, and tomb facades. Not enough, but real, and from the inside. For the wars with Greece, that essentially stops. The Persians left no account of these campaigns. None. There is no Persian narrative of Marathon, no royal inscription describing Salamis, no tablet recording a defeat. In the Persian royal record, the Greeks appear as one more nation on a list, no larger than the Bactrians, and the wars are not mentioned as events at all. So nearly everything that follows comes from Herodotus, who wrote about 50 years after the fact, and from Aeschylus, who wrote a play about it, and from later Greek writers drawing on both. All of them are from the winning side of a war that they regarded as the central event in their history, and their account has shaped every retelling since, including the films you have seen, including this one. That does not make Herodotus worthless. He is a serious inquirer. He traveled widely. He names his sources. He frequently reports two versions and tells you he does not know which is right. And archaeology has confirmed him on a good many specific things. But he is also the man who reports that the Persian army numbered over 5 million. So everything from here is the Greek version. I will flag it where it matters. It starts with a revolt. The Greek cities on the western coast of Asia Minor had been Persian subjects since Cyrus took Lydia. In 499, they rose, led initially by the ruler of Miletus, and they got help from Athens, which sent 20 ships. That combined force marched inland to Sardis, the western capital, and burned it, including, apparently by accident, a temple. The revolt was crushed over the following 6 years. Miletus was taken and destroyed, its temple burned, its population deported, and Athens was now a name on a list in Susa. Herodotus says Darius asked who these Athenians were, and then had a servant instructed to say to him 3 times at every dinner, "Master, remember the Athenians." That is almost certainly a literary invention. What is not invented is that in 490 a Persian force crossed the Aegean, took the island of Naxos, destroyed the city of Eretria, which had also sent ships, and landed at a bay called Marathon about 25 miles from Athens. The Athenians came out to meet them with about 9,000 men, plus 1,000 from the small city of Plataea, who came because they were allies and because nobody else did. Sparta had been asked, but said they could not march until the moon was full, for religious reasons, and did not arrive until it was over. The Athenian commanders decided to attack. They thinned their center and strengthened both wings, ran the last stretch to close the distance under archery fire, and the wings held and enveloped while the center gave ground. The Persians broke and ran for the ships, and were cut down at the water and in the marsh. Herodotus gives the casualties as 6,400 Persians and 192 Athenians. The second number is probably close to right, because the Athenians buried their dead in a mound at the site and knew exactly who they were, and read the names out annually for centuries. The first number is a guess by the winners. Marathon mattered enormously to the Athenians, and mattered very little to the Persian Empire. It was a punitive expedition, not an invasion, and it failed, and Darius planned a proper one and then died before he could launch it. And the famous run is not in Herodotus. What is in Herodotus is a professional long-distance runner sent from Athens to Sparta before the battle to ask for help, who covered about 140 miles in 2 days, which is a far more impressive feat than the modern race. The story of a man running from Marathon to Athens, with news of the victory and dropping dead, appears 600 years later in a different author, and the modern Marathon is named after an event that our best source does not record. The invasion came 10 years later, under Darius' son. Xerxes had spent the first years of his reign putting down revolts in Egypt and Babylon, and by 480 he was ready. He assembled an army from across the empire and marched it round the top of the Aegean. He bridged the Hellespont, the strait between Asia and Europe, about a mile wide, with two lines of ships lashed together and cabled, with a roadway laid over them and screens on the sides so the animals could not see the water. Herodotus says the first attempt was destroyed by a storm, and that Xerxes, in a rage, had the engineers beheaded and ordered the strait itself given 300 lashes and a set of fetters thrown into it, while a man shouted at the water that it was a bitter stream and its master was crossing it whether it liked it or not. Whether or not that happened, it is the single most quoted anecdote about Xerxes, and it is the foundation of 2,500 years of writing about Oriental despotism, and its only source is a Greek historian working from hostile hearsay half a century later. Hold it loosely. He also had a canal cut through the peninsula at Mount Athos, because a previous fleet had been wrecked rounding it. Herodotus reports that too, and it was regarded for a long time as an exaggeration. And then, in the 1990s, a geophysical survey found the canal. It is there under the fields, the full width, dug and then abandoned. The size of the army is the great problem. Herodotus gives an infantry figure of 1,700,000 and a grand total, with camp followers, of over 5 million. That is impossible. An army of that size, moving on foot, could not be watered or fed by the countryside it passed through, and the column would have stretched for hundreds of miles. Modern estimates vary widely, based on logistics, water supply, and the capacity of the road. Something between 70,000 and 300,000 fighting men is the usual range, which is still, for the 5th century before Christ, the largest force ever assembled anywhere. Two details about the army, because both of them are famous, and one of them may not exist. The first is real. The Persian army was not a Persian army. It was a coalition drawn from every province, and Herodotus gives a long catalogue of the contingents in the invasion force, describing each nation's equipment, and the catalogue is one of the best things in his book precisely because it is so specific. What each people wore, what they carried, whether they used bows or javelins or axes. Ethiopians with palm wood bows, Thracians in fox skin caps, Indians in cotton. It reads like a costume list, and it is probably drawn from real observation, because that is exactly the sort of thing a 5th century Greek could have found out by asking around a port. The core of the army was Persian and Median, heavy on cavalry and on massed archery. The standard infantryman carried a large wicker shield, a spear, and a bow, and the tactical system was to shoot until the enemy formation was damaged and then close. It works extremely well against most opponents, and it works badly against a wall of long spears carried by men in bronze who have closed the distance, which is the specific problem the Greeks presented, and later, in a much worse form, the Macedonians. The second detail is the Immortals. You know the name. 10,000 elite troops, always maintained at exactly 10,000, so that whenever one of them was killed or fell sick, a replacement stepped in immediately, and the number never changed, and the unit therefore never diminished, and was called by the Greeks the Immortals. That is Herodotus, and it is a lovely image, and there is a real possibility that it is a mishearing. The theory runs like this. The old Persian word for the king's companions or followers is close to, but not the same as, the word for immortal, a difference of one sound. If Herodotus, or the informant Herodotus was talking to, heard the first and understood the second, then the elite unit called the king's companions became the immortals in Greek, and stayed that way for 2,500 years, and the whole business of the constant 10,000 is a rationalization invented to explain the name. I want to be fair to the other side, because this is contested and not settled. There is no Persian text that gives us the unit's actual name, so the argument is a reconstruction from linguistics rather than a document. And a standing royal guard of a fixed number is not implausible in itself. But it is worth knowing that the most famous unit in Persian military history may owe its name to somebody mishearing a word at a party. They came down through Thessaly and the Greeks who had decided to resist, and it was a minority of Greek states. Most of the north simply joined the Persians, which is left out of most retellings, chose to hold a pass on the coast. Thermopylae. Here is what the pass was: a road running along the coast between mountain and sea, and at its narrowest at the time, perhaps 50 feet wide, with an old defensive wall across it that the Greeks rebuilt. It is now a wide, flat plain, because 2,500 years of silt from the river have pushed the coastline miles out. You can stand at Thermopylae today and not see the sea. The Greek force was commanded by Leonidas, one of the two kings of Sparta, and it included 300 Spartans. It also included about 7,000 other Greeks, and I want to be specific about that, because their erasure is one of the most complete in popular history. There were Thespians, Thebans, Corinthians, Arcadians, Phocians, Locrians, Mycenaeans, Tugians. The 300 Spartans were a small fraction of the force, and they each had a personal attendant with them who is never counted, so even the Spartan contingent was larger than 300. They held the pass for 2 days. On the third, a local man showed the Persians a mountain track that came round behind the position. Leonidas learned of it and dismissed most of the army so that they could get away and fight another day, and stayed with his 300 to hold the rear. And the 700 Thespians stayed with him. They were not professional soldiers. Sparta was a military state whose men had no other occupation. Thespiae was an ordinary small city with farmers in it, and the 700 who stayed were most of its adult male population, and by staying, they effectively ended their own community. They were all killed. There were also about 400 Thebans there, whose situation Herodotus describes as coerced, and who surrendered. So when you hear about the 300, the honest number is around 1,500 men who chose to die there, and the ones with the strongest claim on being remembered for it are the farmers. The Greek fleet fought a simultaneous action at Artemisium and withdrew. The Persians came south. Athens was evacuated. The entire population moved to Salamis and Aegina and the Peloponnese, and the city was taken, and the temples on the Acropolis were burned. That is the revenge for Sardes, and it is on the record. And then the war turned in a strait. The Greek fleet was at Salamis, an island just off the Athenian coast, with a narrow channel between it and the mainland. The Greek commanders were arguing about whether to fight there or fall back to the isthmus. Themistocles of Athens wanted to fight in the narrows, because the Persian fleet was larger and better sailed, and would lose that advantage in a confined space where it could not maneuver or use its numbers. He is said to have sent a secret message to Xerxes telling him the Greeks were about to break up and flee, and that if he blocked the exits, he could destroy them all at once. Xerxes blocked the exits. In the morning, the Greek ships came out into the channel, and the Persian fleet came in after them, in column, into a space too narrow to deploy, with a swell running and their own rear ranks pushing the front ranks forward into the wreckage. Xerxes watched it from a throne set up on the hillside on the mainland, which we know because a Greek playwright who fought in these wars wrote a tragedy about it 8 years later, performed in Athens, in which the disaster is described entirely from the Persian side, in the voice of grieving Persian elders and the mother of the king. It is the earliest surviving play in European literature. It is a play about the enemy's suffering, staged in the city the enemy burned, within living memory, and the Athenians gave it first prize. Xerxes went home with part of the army. The rest wintered in Greece under a general called Mardonius and was destroyed the following summer at Plataea. And on the same day, so the tradition says, the fleet was beaten at Mycale on the Asian coast. And that is the end of the invasion, and it is not the end of the empire, and here is where I have to say the difficult thing. If you learn this story at school, this is where it stops. The Persians are repelled, Greece is saved, the classical age begins, and the Persian Empire exits the narrative. The Persian Empire went on for another 150 years. That is longer than the entire history of the United States as an independent nation. At the time these words are being written, the Achaemenid Empire after Salamis lasted longer than it had lasted before Salamis. It kept every one of its core territories. It lost nothing that mattered. Xerxes reigned for 21 years and was murdered in his bedroom. The killing was arranged by the commander of the royal bodyguard, working with a court official, and it took the crown prince with it. One account says the assassins persuaded another of the king's sons that his brother had done it, so that he killed the heir and was then killed himself. The details vary by source, and all the sources are late. What is certain is that in 465, the king of the largest empire on earth was killed by the men whose specific job was to keep him alive, and that his son Artaxerxes came to the throne over the bodies of both. That pattern repeats. It is the single real structural weakness of the Achaemenid system, and it has nothing to do with decadence. The empire had no fixed rule of succession. The king had many wives and many sons, and the choice of heir was the king's, and it could be changed, and the sons all knew it. So every transfer of power was a competition, and the competitors had provinces and troops and treasuries of their own, because that is how you employed a royal prince. The court factions that Greek writers describe as eunuch intrigue and harem plotting are stripped of the sneering, exactly what you would expect from a system where the succession is genuinely open and the stakes are the world. It cost them time. It did not cost them the empire, but it meant that roughly every generation the machine stopped for a year or two while the family sorted itself out, and every one of those pauses was an opportunity for somebody at the edges. The most famous of them produced a book. In 401, a younger son called Cyrus, satrap of the western provinces, marched on his brother the king with an army that included about 10,000 Greek mercenaries. They met at a place called Kyawonyxa, not far from Babylon. The Greeks won on their part of the field and Cyrus was killed on another part of it, which meant the mercenaries had won a battle in the middle of an empire on behalf of a man who no longer existed. Their generals were then invited to a parley and killed, and the 10,000, leaderless, 1,000 miles from the sea, elected new commanders on the spot and walked out north up through the mountains in winter, fighting the whole way, until they came over a pass and the men in front started shouting, and the men behind thought it was an attack and ran forward, and it was the Black Sea. One of the men they elected wrote it down afterwards. His name was Xenophon, and his account is the first great escape narrative in European literature, and it did something more consequential than that. It told every Greek who read it that a Greek infantry force could march into the heart of the Persian Empire and march out again. 70 years later, a Macedonian king used that as an argument, and then his son used it as a plan. So we have to talk about decline, and we have to talk about who says so. The standard account of the last century and a half of the empire is that it decayed, that after Xerxes the kings were weak, that the court was ruled by eunuchs and harem intrigue, that the Persians became soft and luxurious, that provinces slipped away, and that by the time Alexander arrived the whole thing was rotten and fell at a touch. Every element of that account comes from Greek writers, and the ones we rely on most for the 4th century were, in several cases, employed by Persia or writing for audiences being encouraged to invade it. The idea that Persia was decadent and ripe for conquest was not a neutral historical judgment. It was a political argument being made out loud by Greek orators in the decades before Philip of Macedon, and then his son invaded. It was the case for the war, and it was then written up as history by the winners. The evidence from inside the empire does not match it well. Building continued. Administration continued. The Babylonian business archives, which are private commercial documents kept by banking families over generations and which have no reason to flatter anybody, show a functioning, prosperous economy through the 4th century with no sign of collapse. So here is a fairer version. There were real problems, and they were structural rather than moral. The succession was violent. Several kings came to the throne over the bodies of brothers, and a court that has to fight over every transfer of power loses time and talent each time. Egypt did successfully break away in 404 and stayed independent for 60 years, which was a serious loss of revenue and prestige, and it was reconquered. In the 360s, several Western satraps revolted at once, though not in a coordinated way and not successfully, and the empire ran increasingly on Greek mercenaries, which is not a sign of weakness so much as a sign of a labor market. Greece exported soldiers because Greece was poor and full of trained men with no work. Set against that, Artaxerxes II reigned for 46 years, the longest of any Persian king. When his brother marched on him with an army including 10,000 Greek mercenaries, he beat him in the field. His successor took Egypt back. The empire that Alexander attacked in 334 was territorially almost intact. What defeated it was not rot. It was a Macedonian army under 2 consecutive military geniuses, using a weapons system nobody had a good answer to, at a moment when Persia had just been through a particularly bad succession, a vizier poisoning 2 kings in a row and installing a distant relative, Darius III, who was competent enough but who had been on the throne for 2 years and had not had time to secure anything. It took Alexander 4 years and 3 battles. Grunicus in 334 at a river crossing, Issus in 333 in a coastal defile, where Darius' larger army could not deploy the same trap as Salamis on land, and Gorgumila in 331 on open ground chosen and cleared by the Persians, where the Macedonians won anyway. Babylon opened its gates, as it had to Cyrus. Susa surrendered, and in the winter of 330, Alexander came to Persepolis. He took the treasury, which was enormous, and needed thousands of pack animals to move. And then the terrace burned. There are 2 ancient accounts of why. One says it was deliberate policy, revenge for the burning of the Acropolis 150 years earlier, a symbolic closing of the account announced and carried out. The other says it happened at a drinking party, that an Athenian courtesan called Thais proposed it in front of the assembled company, that the idea caught, and that the king and his companions went through the halls with torches, and that he regretted it afterwards. The archaeology says only that the fire was thorough, and that the buildings were full of combustible material, cedar beams and roofs and hangings, and that the palaces of Xerxes burned particularly hot. The clay tablets in the fortification wall were baked by it, which is why we have them. Darius III was already dead by then, killed by one of his own satraps while fleeing east. Alexander is said to have found the body, covered it with his own cloak, and had it sent back for burial in the royal tombs. And that is the end of the Achaemenid Empire. 220 years, from a small kingdom on a plateau to the largest state the world had seen, ended by an invasion from a kingdom on its northwestern fringe that its own records had barely bothered to name. The empire ended. The idea did not. The Parthians, and then the Susaenians ruled from that plateau for the next 800 years, and the Susaenians deliberately cut their reliefs into the rock at Naksh-i-Rustam, beneath the tombs of Darius and Xerxes, claiming the inheritance, and the administrative model, provinces, roads, a courier system, tolerated local religion, tribute assessed and written down, was picked up by Alexander's successors, and by Rome, and by the caliphates, and is in a real sense still the default shape of a large state. One last stretch of road, and then we will go up the cliff. It is night, and you are lying in the long room at a station, and you cannot sleep yet. Think about what has to be true for this room to exist. Somebody surveyed this route, and decided this was the right distance from the last place. Somebody quarried and carted the stone for the wall. Somebody dug the well and lined it. Somebody, every year, is allocated the grain that gets stored here, and somebody carts it, and somebody counts it in and counts it out. There is a man whose entire working life is spent at this one yard in the middle of nothing, receiving strangers, and there is a record somewhere with his name on it and what he is paid. Multiply that by 111 stations on this road alone, and then by all the other roads, and then extend it from the Aegean to the Indus, and that is the empire. Not the king, not the battles. This, a very large number of ordinary people, most of whom never saw a Persian in their lives, doing small administrative jobs correctly, for generations, in a system that mostly paid them and mostly left their gods alone. That is why it lasted 220 years, and it is why almost nothing about it is exciting, and it is why the only people who wrote a thrilling story about it were the ones who fought it twice and lost the rest of the time. The lamp at the end of the room goes out. Outside, somewhere on the road you came in on, a courier is riding through the dark towards the next station with a leather bag in the rain, because that is the arrangement. But the words on the cliff stayed unreadable. That is where we finish, on the road under the mountain, 300 feet down from the writing, in the 1830s. By then, nobody had been able to read cuneiform for something like 1800 years. The knowledge did not fade slowly, it stopped. The script went out of use. The last people who could read it died, and after that it was just marks. Europeans traveling in Persia copied inscriptions and brought them home, and scholars stared at them and got almost nowhere for 2 centuries. It was not even certain, at first, that the marks were writing at all rather than decoration. A young officer of the British East India Company, posted to Persia as a military advisor, started climbing the cliff. His name was Henry Rawlinson. He was in his 20s. He went up in 1835 and kept going back for years. To copy the old Persian text, which is on the lower left, he stood on the top rung of a ladder on a ledge about 18 inches wide, holding his notebook in his left hand, steadying himself against the rock with his body, and wrote with his right. To reach across a gap, he laid a plank between 2 ladders and worked from that. The Babylonian version was worse. It is on a separate face, above and to the left, over an overhang, and it could not be reached at all by ladder. He eventually hired a local boy. The account describes him as a Kurdish boy who volunteered, and nothing else about him survives, not even a name, who went up a crack in the rock face, worked his way across the overhang, holding on with fingers and toes, drove a peg in and rigged a rope swing, and then hung out over 300 feet of air, making paper squeezes of an inscription he could not read, in a language nobody had spoken for 2,000 years. We do not know that boy's name. That is worth one moment of silence in a video full of kings. What Rawlinson brought down was the key. Because Behistun is trilingual, and because one of the 3 languages was Old Persian, which was related to Sanskrit and to Avestan, both of which were known, the same text existed 3 times in 3 scripts. Work out the Old Persian, and you have a translation of the other two. It is precisely what the Rosetta Stone was for Egyptian hieroglyphs, and it did the same job. The Old Persian fell first, through the 1830s and 40s, worked out by Rawlinson and independently and earlier in part, by a German schoolteacher called Georg Grotefend, who had made the crucial first guesses decades before from copies alone and been largely ignored. Then Elumite, then hardest, Babylonian, which is not alphabetic at all, and where a single sign can have several completely different values. The Babylonian decipherment was so contested that in 1857 the Royal Asiatic Society ran an examination. They took a newly excavated inscription that none of the scholars had seen, sent sealed copies to 4 men working separately in different places, and had them submit translations in sealed envelopes to be opened together in front of a committee. The 4 translations agreed. And with that, a door opened that has not closed since. Not just Persia, everything. Sumerian and Akkadian and Assyrian and Babylonian, 3,000 years of Mesopotamian writing, the law codes and the letters and the temple accounts and the flood stories. Hundreds of thousands of tablets in the world's museums that had been mute objects and were suddenly documents. The earliest literature on Earth became readable because a young man with a bad head for heights hung off a rope in Iran and copied out a king's justification of himself. And here is the last turn, and it is the reason we started where we started. The text they used to unlock the ancient world was a text about whether a king was telling the truth. Darius wrote it to be unalterable. He put it where no one could reach it and cut away the ledges behind him. And he wrote into it, over and over, that it was not lies, and instructed whoever should read it in the future to believe him and not to conceal it. And it worked. It survived intact for 23 centuries, exactly as he wanted, and it was read at last, exactly as he asked. And the first thing the readers did was to notice how much he was protesting, and to start asking who Bardia really was. That is the shape of the whole thing, I think. An empire that told the world a story about itself in stone, 300 feet up, meant to last forever. And underneath, in a wall, in a basket, 30,000 clay receipts that nobody meant to keep, recording flour and wine, and a bonus paid to a woman who had just given birth, which is how we actually know what it was like to be there. The cliff got the last word for 2,500 years. The receipts are winning now. Sleep well.